absolute positioning to position elements within a web page. For this demonstration, I'll be working with an exercise file that you can find in your class files folder underneath the subdirectory Positioning and Visibility and within the Exercises folder. And the file's name is positioning.html. I'll be working off of a copy of that file, and for my demonstration I'll be using an attached style sheet. In the exercise file you'll be using an embedded style sheet, but you can also take the style settings and move them into a style sheet if you like. So my style sheet is open on the right and the HTML file is open on the left. You can see a link at the top of the HTML file that links in the style sheet on the right. And what you see on the right in the style sheet is what you'll start with when you do the exercise. And the starter file is kind of set up for relative positioning for the plot element. So if you look in the HTML, the plot is a div. It's a container element for some image elements that we have inside of it. We'll be using to build a house, and what we'll be trying to do with absolute positioning in this case is move those elements and put them all together so that they look like a real house. So if I view this right now in my browser, you can see all the pieces of the house have just lined up. They're still in their normal positioning, which is just a flow type layout, and so they just wrap down inside of the div, or when they since the div is given a specific height, the elements go kind of behind the div or underneath or extend beyond the div. So what I want to first do is go ahead and comment out the relative positioning and use absolute. Now the relative that I'm currently using just keeps the plot div centered inside the screen. So when I view this in the browser, to show it one more time before I actually switch it, you'll notice that all of the elements in the plot itself, as my browser window gets wider or narrower, they stay centered. And that's what the settings of relative and in the margin, the 10 auto 0 and then auto, the two autos are for the left and right hand side, and that keeps it equal distance from the left and right hand side of the browser window. And then it's got a 10 pixel setting that's bringing it down from the top. Well, what I want to do so I can do absolute positioning for everything is just comment this out. So I'll put some comment blocks around it, and then I want to go here where I've got some absolute positioning set and take the comment blocks out. So I should get the same effect with this. It's going to be using absolute positioning for the plot, but it's going to have a left setting of 50% of the element itself, the div, and then a left margin moves it negative 250 pixels back, so the end result is it should stay centered. So it shouldn't look any different. Now when I view it in the browser, everything stays nice and centered. Now what I want to do is absolutely position the main image, the chimney, roof, door, and window. And we're going to use absolute positioning to do that. So the first thing I'll do is, you can see we've got ID selectors or ID attributes for all the images as well as the ID for the plot. And I need to add a selector in my style sheet for those IDs for the main, roof, chimney, door, window. So I'm going to do that right now. Just do one for main. I'm just going to stub them out, come back and add my settings in afterwards. Roof, chimney, door, and finally window. So that takes care of my selectors. Now I'm going to mark each one of these with the position setting and set it to absolute. Then I'll copy this line and paste it. And with just that change in place, let's take a look at what this has done. So when we look at it back in the browser, what the absolute setting does is it takes them out of their normal flow and places them absolutely positioned to, if I don't specify a number, to the 0, top 0 and left hand side 0 of whatever container element. So the container element in this case, this is the plot, but all the image elements have their top left corner positioned in that top left corner of the div box, the container box. So what I need to do now is use numbers top and left, or I could use bottom and right, but one or the other of those number systems, I need to move pretty much all of these down from their top, and I need to move them over from the left hand side. So that's what I'll be doing, is giving them a top positive number to move the element down to a certain location, and then a positive number that will move them from the left hand edge of the container box. So the real trick is just finding out the numbers to use for all this, but I've already figured out all those numbers. So the numbers that I would use for the main, I'm going to give it a top of 150 pixels, and then we'll give it a left of 50 pixels. Again, you could use bottom and right settings. It would just be different numbers. You'd have to figure out what the number values are to get them positioned to where you want them. For the roof, we use a top of 60 pixels. We use a left of 34 pixels. And for my chimney, we use top 65 pixels and left of 261 pixels. The door will do top 242 pixels and left of 353 pixels. And finally, the window, do a top 296 pixels and a left of 129 pixels. And provided I got all these numbers right, they should line up in the browser. Let's take a look. That looks pretty good. Again, as I move, everything stays centered inside of the div element, so those absolute numbers are always within the plot div. The green border represents my plot div, and the numbers always stay consistent. The plot div moves, but the elements inside of it stay with their position numbering that I gave them. So that's absolute positioning. With the numbers, you can absolutely position any element inside of its container. The container does have to be marked as either relative or absolute, so that's important. So the plot up here, we didn't necessarily need to make it absolute. We could have left it relative, but it would have to be one or the other of those, so that those inner child elements, then the number systems are in relation to that parent element. And then the positive top and then the positive left number moves it down from the top and over from the left, or you could also use a bottom and right number. But with the absolute position, you get total control of where your elements are placed inside the page.